Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, on day 4, the EPA was finally allowed access to the spill site and quickly discovered the body of John Elmer Smith Jr. They also found that most of a tank of potassium cresslate had spilled right next to the ruptured chlorine tank. We now continue with Part 1 and the conclusion of Chapter 15, Discoveries. April 14. Pressure built to reopen I-90 because the two-lane detour to the north was in bad shape and accidents likely to happen. Impatient traffic ran bumper to bumper on the 81-mile stretch from St. Regis to the Y. But Car 3 still held 60,000 gallons, and at times a visible chlorine plume drifted to I-90. At a Sunday I-90 closure meeting, Montana DOT pushed to reopen. Jim Weaver: what risk if the drivers are advised to keep their windows closed and not stop on the roadway? The highway department could stop the cars in the 5-minute warning time. Other officials were against the idea. The Petty Creek roadblock was 4 miles from the spill. If a westbound car made it through just after a notice to close I-90, the driver could unknowingly race a plume to an intercept. Officials confirmed the partial reopening at the 2 p.m. evacuee meeting. Along with Waldron, Watts, and others, EPA's Weiss and Leahy of the Health Department made their first panel appearance. Weiss had visited Petty Creek and Ponderosa Acres and told evacuees now, "It is very safe to re-enter the area with respect to residual chemicals. We think your home is safe." Weiss later said he scouted out the exclusion zone. "That first day we went into some of the lowest places I could find, including many basements. I sniffed them out," he said, with his nose. The likelihood of hydrochloric acid being persistent in the environment, the possibility of that was very, very slight, he said. But in her April 14 advisory, Leahy had warned of residual chlorine pockets and contaminated vegetation. Leahy relied on Weiss, she said, big time for information. Weiss now assured the returning residents the EPA was continually monitoring the activity in the hot zone and had reviewed the evacuation plan in the event of a failure. But why take the risk at all? There was no pressure from these residents to return early, and many had noted odors and symptoms during visits. Linda Frost of MRL announced to evacuees that free YMCA passes were available, including use of their swimming pool. There was no concern over chlorinated pools. This would soon change. For the first time in evacuee meeting minutes, specific audience questions were summarized, and one reflected a never-before-mentioned concern. Question: my wife has been having reactions. Dr. Walter Peschel answered, "No evidence of exposure that would lead to long-term health problems. Whatever these reactions were, they should only be temporary." Peschel was a contract doctor for MRL through St. Patrick Hospital. MRL's handout summarized Peschel. Most people get complete recovery if they have healthy lungs and experience limited exposure to the gas. People with pre-existing lung conditions such as asthma may experience more intense lung irritation and long-term medical problems. Visits by residents for animal care would continue in the exclusion zone. Hot zone animals would still be tended to by hazmat techs. The Missoulians' account offers significantly more information concerning questions and complaints. Some evacuees at Sunday's meeting were openly distrustful of MRL and the safeness of returning. Southside Road resident Jamie Becker felt there hadn't been disclosure of what had spilled from the other car, which MRL referred to as a caustic substance. "We have no idea what's in it," Becker said. "I don't want to be asking about one thing if the problem is something else." People from the audience told Becker to shut up. Becker praised response personnel, but added, "I think they're exposing themselves to things they don't even know about." Waldron replied that no information was being held back. But the public had yet to be told 17,000 gallons of cresslate had spilled. Other audience members praised MRL for providing food and shelter. MRL offered to continue to house residents who preferred to wait until general re-entry to return to the newly opened area east of Petty Creek. On today's MRL handout, returning residents were told, "Do not leave children and non-drivers at home in the re-entry area without means of evacuating in case an evacuation situation arises again, such as some unplanned disturbance at the cleanup site. Waldron assured there would be plenty of notice. For evacuees, the scenario felt a bit like, "Do you feel lucky?" There was no documented tally of how many people returned in the April 14 partial reentry. Officials later tallied some 84 households, and spot checks successfully contacted just 23 households later that week. The Missoulian reported that the majority of eligible residents chose not to return. Many people expressed concerns about another release of chlorine. Those residents that did return found some horses, quote, bleeding from the nostrils, with red, teary, and swollen eyes, swollen necks, shortness of breath, and lethargy, a much less optimistic animal report than earlier. There was no report on whether residents noted odors or symptoms during the partial reentry. There were no public updates in general on evacuees' symptoms. That evening, the text reported Car 1 ready for transfer, and the Crest Lake car unloaded and shipped. Car 3 loomed. Fresh product is continuing to come out of the car, the text noted, a green gas that also released from the soil. The plan, they said, is to move Car 3 as little as possible to be able to patch it, then roll it level. Missoula Hazmat noted, decon crew complaining of headaches. Need to talk about headaches. Just today, a decon station had been established near the site at the request of the EPA. Jess Mickelson recalled, I know there was some complaint of headaches, and Chris Weiss was pretty much convinced that if you have chronic long-term exposure, you're going to have it. Weiss recalled, folks should have been minimally in level C with respiratory protection, including decon crews. The Crest Lake is not inherently highly volatile, he said, not like chlorine, for example. But that said, there was certainly a light fraction that was evaporating. It smelled like creosote, a type of phenolic compound. The human nose is extremely sensitive to phenols, Weiss said, aromatic organic compounds in the potassium cressolate. Some people are very sensitive to those types of odors. They can be associated with headaches, they can be associated with nausea, and in high concentrations, they can cause various types of neurological effects, like you might get from alcohol. Did everybody always wear their respirator? I don't think so, Weiss said. Chlorinated phenols, he said, had a pesticide-like smell. Phenols less so, maybe a little sweeter smell. Though no one yet had made a connection, these descriptions matched what many residents reported. One more discovery awaited this day. Sawmill Gulch and Sear residents had never been evacuated, despite living within the exclusion zone. Mineral County Sheriff O'Brien made no call for evacuation on April 11, even after IC established the western perimeter at Sear Exit. Officials knew that chlorine gas traveled well beyond at least the Fish Creek, where an ambulance crew had refused to go further. IC, Missoula Hazmat, 911, and the Sear roadblock crews knew the residents were still there because residents complained of smells the night of April 11. Officials knew that ongoing chlorine releases sometimes drifted west. The people in Sawmill Gulch were closer to the spill than Petty Creek, which became the new eastern boundary on April 14. Tom Ziegler recalled that if there were another significant release and the wind shifted, the potential was very high that the gas could reach Sawmill Gulch, he said. These residents had knowingly been left behind. Dismissed back on April 12, Jim Peters called again. The Mineral County Sheriff's log noted at 5:25 p.m., Sergeant Ball called to advise that he got a call from Jim Peters at Hart Ranch and that he should have been evacuated. Ball was advised by dispatch that no one had been evacuated from Sawmill Gulch. Ball stated this was a mistake and everyone needed to be evacuated. Yet Sheriff O'Brien now ordered all units advised to not evacuate Sawmill Gulch. Instead, residents were advised to listen for the siren for evacuation, emergency evacuation. By the 8:30 p.m. IC briefing, Sawmill Gulch had become a top issue. At least 30 residents remained. Waldron asked, how do we justify leaving them? We need to have them evacuated. IC log. All incident command staff agrees that they absolutely need to be evacuated. They are currently in the exclusion zone. There is a potential for release of gas during the offloading process. Hazmat would accompany officers for the evacuation. Residents are to be asked to bring all animals with them. But, once again, animals would be left behind. Sergeant Ball first heard about the Sawmill people on Sunday. It would have been the sheriff that was calling the shots because he had first-hand knowledge, Ball said. But as part of Unified Command, Ball had oversight over Mineral County law enforcement. Ball agreed Sawmill needed to be evacuated. Knowing where the accident was and knowing the proximity to it, he said it wouldn't take much of a wind change. And that whole area was way too close to get back in there and do proper notifications in case of another release. Jess Mickelson thought it was an overlook, pretty and simple. But he wasn't sure who overlooked Sawmill Gulch. Because of the EPA shutout, the agency had little oversight up to this time. I.C. Waldron was hazy about the lack of evacuation. No, he said, I wasn't aware, I don't think. I don't recall. MRL noted of Sawmill's families, they were not evacuated initially for an unknown reason. The tech group noted, apparently they called in to find out why they had not been evacuated. Coincidentally, the next morning's Missoulian ran a feature that riffed off the television series The Twilight Zone. Reporter Alika Rutland interviewed by phone residents of the Sawmill Gulch area. Resident Juanita Putzgar noted the peacefulness of the lack of trains and cars, and yet it's also spooky, she said. You feel you're the last people in the world. She and others made contact with the Sear roadblock to find out what's happening. Some families felt safe because wind blew generally from the west, and the chlorine smell was never really that bad, some said. This was the first published report of residents west of the spill smelling a spill chemical. Accompanying this lighthearted article was a map correctly depicting the exclusion zone. Rutland and her editors drew no connection between their dots. Unwittingly, she had interviewed people left behind in a potential toxic zone. While officials decided to evacuate Sawmill the next day, as night arrived, chlorine levels rose, a pattern of high nocturnal readings revealed by Marine's new monitoring. At 7:50 to 7:55 p.m., direct readings hit 41 to 48 parts per million at the east hot zone barrier and 12 to 20 parts per million at the north hot zone barrier near the river. By 10:30, and again after midnight, direct readings on I-90 at mile marker 73 hit up to 7.2 parts per million, accompanied by a, quote, strong chlorine odor. Especially at night, any gas upon the river tended to flow downstream to Sear and Sawmill Gulch. April 15. On Monday, transloading of chlorine was again put off to evacuate Sawmill Gulch and Sear. 13 households belatedly evacuated, according to logs. Other households from the area had earlier self-evacuated. Despite the request to remove animals, Tom Ziegler recalled he later helped feed animals left behind at Sawmill Gulch. We went up there and were amazed at how many houses were up there, he said. While Sheriff O'Brien decided not to initiate evacuations, Incident Command, MRL, the Tech Group, the Missoula Sheriff's Department, the Missoula Rural Fire Department, and the Health Department collectively failed to discover that Sawmill and Sear had not been evacuated. Publicly, no one took responsibility. Diane Roberts and family lived right by the Sear exit. She noticed the chlorine smell on the night of April 11 and 12. It was pretty potent that night, she said. In subsequent days, the smell returned, but still they weren't evacuated. It was like the world had ended, and we were the only ones out here. Many families self-evacuated, she said, at their own cost. While she visited the roadblock trailer on Sunday, a vehicle arrived with 2 men from the Frenchtown Fire Department. The one guy just said, yeah, it's pretty scary. There hasn't even been a monitor. And then another guy just turned to him and more or less told him to shut up. Roberts understood this to mean that the roadblock had no chlorine monitor. The one guy just walked out before the other and said that everything was okay. And then the next day I was at work and they evacuated us. The man who told his partner to shut up identified himself as Scott Waldron, Roberts said, the incident commander. As the 2 men left, Roberts thought, oh my gosh, we haven't got any monitors. One roadblock staff actively fought for evacuation. Roberts' friend Wayne Boyes of the Montana Department of Transportation. He said that if you guys don't evacuate, then I'm going to go and cause a lot of trouble and evacuate them. He said they didn't even have a plan and they didn't even know who was back there up Sawmill Gulch. Roberts saw maps of the exclusion zone much later when the family talked to claims agents. We saw maps then, and I said, we are right here. The Roberts family never received an official explanation or an apology. Wayne Boyes of Tarkio worked a few swing shifts at the Sear roadblock beginning Friday or Saturday. While he didn't notice a gas smell, he didn't recall a chlorine monitor on site until Sunday, April 14. Boyes also didn't recall the crew having gas masks in case of emergency. Even more worrisome, the Sear exit crew had difficulty keeping radio contact with the spill site, their main source of warning of any oncoming gas release. Boyes warned area residents who stopped by the trailer about the threat from a wind shift and became especially concerned after he saw a map of the exclusion zone handed out by Hazmat on April 13. I pointed out to the deputies and the search and rescue people that it showed the sawmill area being evacuated, he said. And we all knew that they weren't evacuated. That Saturday, Boyes became angry at the roadblock crew. I just said that somebody needs to know about this, and they just said, well, nobody's ordered us to do it. Boyes warned the residents. I was encouraging them to leave because I figured it was awful close if the wind changed. Most of Sawmill was 2 miles west of the spill, the same distance as Alberton. Late on Boyes' Sunday night shift, a technical crew from the site stopped by. They seemed concerned, Boyes said. Oh, really? You mean there are still people there? The techs decided not to move anybody until the next morning. Years later, Boyes still couldn't get over how nobody moved when I pointed out that it looked like a mistake. Chlorine and/or pesticide-like gas had already reached the area. Boyes' concern would be further justified later when a chlorine spike coincided with a strong wind shift from the east, which could have resulted in significant exposure to Sawmill area residents. Shirley Anderson of Sawmill Gulch Road called the Mineral County Sheriff's Office on April 11 to ask about evacuation. And they said no, she said. They weren't evacuating, reflecting a conscious decision by Sheriff O'Brien. Later that night, when Jim Peters warned neighbors, I opened the door, Anderson said, and the smell was atrocious, something like a real strong weed killer. I mean, it was really overwhelming. Anderson and others kept in touch with the Mineral County Sheriff's Office. They just said no, that they hadn't gotten any orders for us to leave yet. On the day she was finally evacuated, Anderson was given no explanations, other than the fact that they kept saying that they thought everybody had been evacuated, she said. Sear Resident 1 lived near the Sear exit. They didn't overlook us, she said. Sear 1 began calling 911 and MRL's hotline, beginning the 11th or 12th. When I called the first time and asked about it, and they were like, well, you're not in an evacuation area because it's not being carried in that direction. It's being blown eastward, the plume, and that you're not in any danger. She hadn't yet seen a map of the exclusion zone. I think they were trying to save money, she speculated, and when the wind shifted, they changed their mind. But I think it was also public pressure. I think I called about 3 times complaining about the smell. I remember one time, I think it was an MRL person, they told us that we were certainly free to leave the area if we didn't feel safe. And I remember getting real pissed and telling the woman, if I had the money to leave, I would do that. Like, screw you people. You're telling us that we can certainly leave if we're feeling uncomfortable, but you're not going to help us? Sear 1 recalled, there were times when it smelled really strong. We shut all the windows in the house because of it. And there was a combination of a chlorine smell and a rotten egg smell, sort of sulfur kind of smell. As I remember, you didn't smell them both simultaneously. The sulfur smell was likely mercaptans from the potassium cressolate. These exposures produced heaviness in the chest, Sear 1 said, the burning in the eyes and stuff like that. Sear 1 listed some 20 families in the Sawmill Sear area, perhaps some 50 people, some with resources just left on their own. The Grotbos rented a house near the Sear roadblock. Orrin Grotbo said, the impression I got was that they forgot about us for 3 days. We never got an official explanation why we weren't evacuated right away. We could smell, especially at night, I don't know if it was so much the chlorine smell as it was the fertilizer smell. His wife called it more like a weed and feed. Grotbo had not been aware that his family was in the exclusion zone until he later saw a map in the insurance claims tent in Alberton. But the sheriff's department knew about us, he said. Larry Price of Superior began staffing the roadblock at Sear the evening of April 11, then day shifts afterwards. That first night, he noticed a chlorine smell and some other unidentifiable chemical odor. Within 4 hours, the night when Jim Peters had been so alarmed, Price had a sore throat, began coughing blood, and had difficulty breathing. His eyes became sore and dry, and he had a headache. But Price decided he couldn't walk away from the roadblock and have someone he knew take his place. Besides, he said, I knew my lungs were toasted during this first shift. I was already fucked, and we talked about this, both crews, because we were all feeling different symptoms and stuff. Price said the shift crews decided to stick it out. We didn't have monitors until sometime that weekend, he said, when I see Waldron showed up for a visit. I said, this is the first where I've had anything to do with hazmat where monitors weren't out, and I was told to shut up. It was his game, Waldron told him. He knew what he was doing. Regardless, Price said, we were told emphatically that we were safe. Concerning lack of a monitor at SEER, Waldron once again claimed ignorance. Waldron, well, I don't know at what point in time, or if I knew specifically that they didn't have one. I have no clue. I think that we did everything we could to make sure we had appropriate monitoring equipment as quickly as we could get it. I guess that's all I can say. I don't know that I knew that they didn't have them. I don't know that I knew where the roadblocks were on that side the first day or so. Price told concerned residents who visited the roadblock to leave if they wanted to, but he could not order an evacuation. He said he got into trouble for advising that because the people that did leave voluntarily wanted financial help from MRL, such as a motel room. Price disputed the public impression that residents were somehow overlooked. We were told that they forgot about these people, he said, which is bullshit, because we were sitting at SEER and I was looking like this at these people, saying, we've got to get them out of there. Every day I logged that for incident command. Price said IC replied, we know they're there, don't worry about it, we believe you're safe where you're in there, and they're safe there. Price recalled radioing in. Get that fucking Waldron on the fucking radio, because I want to ask him if he's just fucking on purpose leaving these people here so close to the wreck in Sawmill Gulch. Because they were. And we talked to them initially, the EPA, about the people in Sawmill Gulch. Here's SEER, here's the line, and here's the houses, we said. We showed them that right in front of the EPA guy. When I was hacking blood and screaming and yelling, you fuckers lied to me, you killed me. He was right there at SEER, at our roadblock. He says, I'll take that under advisement. And then when they finally said, get the people out, we couldn't work fast enough to make them happy enough to get those people out. It's like we were begging them, get these fucking people out of here. Let's move this back. The EPA's Chris Weiss said he visited the SEER roadblock on April 14, the first visit by the EPA. They were kind of lonely out there, actually, he said. They were a little bit scared. I introduced myself as a toxicologist, so everybody had a number of questions, which was my job to try and answer. Weiss didn't recall anyone at the SEER roadblock mentioning Sawmill residents being left behind. If I had heard that, we would have taken action on that, he said. Until Sunday, EPA oversight had been shut out. Before the spill, Price said, I was feeling good. I wasn't even there 4 hours and I couldn't keep from coughing. So I'm saying we've got people here that are way too close. Even the roadblock crew wasn't clear on the boundaries at first. Price said, we were told that it was okay for these people, the local residents, to come in and out, but everybody else doesn't come through. Local access was allowed as if road repair work were being done instead of an evacuation due to a toxic gas. Mineral County Commissioner Charlie Rock of Alberton was told that Sawmill Gulch was eventually evacuated because the wind shifted. This was not true, but even if it had been, it would have only illustrated yet another reactive evacuation in the face of known risks. Resident Paris Young told Rock the chlorine had been thick, Rock recalled. Young self-evacuated on April 12. Commissioner Rock had no understanding why evacuations weren't enforced west of the spill. Unprotected workers, John Elmer Smith, Jr., 17,000 gallons of spilled cressolate, an entire neighborhood left behind. All discoveries on this day, at least for some. What made safety assurances disconcerting was that even as residents were allowed back in the exclusion zone again to feed animals, even as the boundary was reduced to Petty Creek, and even as officials became aware of the failure to evacuate west of the spill, the techs had just discovered that 60,000 pounds of liquid chlorine remained in a tank that unpredictably released more vapor. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. As the techs consider how to tackle the remaining 60,000 pounds of liquid chlorine in Car 3, health officials try to allay residents' growing concerns about their health. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.